I think, can y'all hear me all right? Well, as any married man worth his salt knows, I had done this, this by the way is my very, very first PowerPoint presentation, and as it would have it, it doesn't look anything like a star because my wife reworked it at 11 o'clock last night and I sent it to Mike this morning. She said, she looked at it and she said, it's okay, I'm going to make it better. So she left it. I said, leave the wording alone, but she changed all the appearance. When Mike asked me to do this, I was excited about it, so I entitled my presentation, Creating the Perfect Funeral Service, and last night I added that bottom line, and hopefully a meaningful one too, Observations from the Other Side of the Pulpit. Now Mike is telling you things that all of you, as men of the cloth, and you can relate to. I'm going to tell you the way I see it when you're standing here and I'm standing back there. Just clicking like mine.
Yeah.
I'm kind of low tech. I've been at this 37 years. I started when I was 15 years old. And you can, like Mike says, there's no cookie cutter funerals, and there never should be. But you will always, there are people that attend this church, there are people that attend Brother Goins, Brother Grove's churches. You've stood in your pulpit and preached them a certain set of morals and standards, so they expect you to adhere to those in the funeral. And that's fine, but you, like Mike says, you shouldn't have just every funeral be the same. But what I've seen is there's, in my considered opinion, that each funeral service is unique, but from a minister or a celebrant, and I don't know if you all know what celebrants are. There are people who are not ministers who go get certified as celebrants. I've not dealt with any of them yet. I know several funeral directors have gone and got that designation. I choose not to have it because I don't want to overstep my bounds. My opinion, nothing wrong with it. I just don't feel like that's something that I need to be doing. We're going to briefly touch on these, the importance to the family, the church family, and to the whole community. The easy ones. This is a photo of President John F. Kennedy laying in state at the Capitol. Imagine who, we'll get into that, but I imagine that was probably a pretty easy funeral to do. Church members and friends. These funerals are often put together with great ease, making it easy to put together a very personalized tribute. Mike was talking about the little lady that he did that's a member of this church for 60 years. He's been here 22. It wasn't hard for him to gather information on her. Didn't really have to ask anybody if he didn't have to, didn't want to. He's been a part of this woman's life for ever how many Sundays there are in 23 years. He's been a part of her life and her family's life. Your personal knowledge of the deceased makes these services not easy. I mean, this gets back. He's known this lady for 23 years. Emotional thing to do. But garnering information to present a suitable tribute for her was, I'm sure, easier for him to do, as it would be for anybody. Like I said, gathering information is easy. People are always willing to share their favorite stories about the deceased. Most people are proud and honored to share their memories. And you know as much people, I'm going to tell you something on him. I'm going to tell you a funny story. I'm going to tell you a sweet story. You know, he went and bought coats for 10 kids one time, didn't want anybody to know it. Everybody's got something like that. And even if it's a member of your church, and like you said, there's facets to even people that you look at every Sunday that you don't, there are sides of them you don't know, and they're going to come out in the funeral. Or in your preparations for the funeral. There's the familiar funerals. You know, Brother Bobby Grubbs can relate to this, and Brother Astor Simpson, they both work out at the college. And my wife works there. And many times, we'll ask the family, we'll get down, when would you like the funeral service to be? Well, we'd like it Saturday at 2. Who's the minister going to be? We don't really know anybody. I went to school at Southeast. I know Bobby Grubbs. Do you think you could call Bobby and get him to? I know Astor Simpson, he was one of my instructors. Can you call and get him to do it? Now, that doesn't mean that the person you're being called on to do the funeral is not a Christian. It doesn't mean that you can't, that they're not a member of your church, doesn't mean you can't do the funeral. And when you are presented with these, generally there is a familiar relationship Uh, Somebody asked me to ask Bobby to do the funeral. Bobby can ask that person, so tell me some things. What did they like to do? Did they go to church? Did they not go to church? You can gather everything you need by asking. And a lot of times it can be, let's see, many times the minister or celebrant may not have had the pleasure of making the deceased acquaintance. Sometimes she may be family member or your church member. And how often do you have that happen, Bobby? I know you've done it several times, Mike. That person may not have been able to go to church. Not that they didn't go, they just weren't able to go. And say, hey, can you do this? Or a dear friend of your person, not just recommended by somebody. It could have been somebody that Mike knew that didn't come to his church, or Bobby, or Pastor Goins knew, that didn't come to your church, but you knew them. You had a relationship with them. They were not able to be an active member of their community or their church due to a long or debilitating illness or something similar. I just touched on that. Could be an elderly church member. I'm sure that when those of you that came to a church that was already established, there were some old saints in those churches that you heard a lot of stories about that you probably never ever got to see them until their funeral. And you know, your elderly church members, when one spouse goes and there's nobody here to take care of them, a lot of times the kids will take them to where they live to take care of them. You know the person, you know the stories, you've heard them, but you don't actually see them until you walk in the funeral home the first time. I'm sure there's people that in your churches that when you had their funeral, probably the first time you ever laid eyes on them, but you know a lot about them. And that happens. You know, sometimes it may just be somebody you extended a kindness to. Sometimes it may just be somebody that just knows you. They just know you through, like I say, they just know. They know Mike. Mike, I say it's about Mike, I keep picking on him. Mike goes to a lot, or almost every high school sporting event in this town. And there are a lot of people that know him through that. And there's a lot of people that ask for him because of that reason. Now, I make 95% of the funeral arrangements at our funeral home. And I hear what families say, and I know the reasons they ask for people. And a lot of times they'll say, well, you know, he's supported my grandson's soccer team, or whatever. They know him. They probably never heard him preach, but they know that there's got to be this good man that comes and attends these events, and people ask for him for that reason. They'll ask for you for that reason. It may be somebody that your server at your favorite restaurant, and you go in there, you and your family go in a lot, and you build a rapport with them. I have a young man that waits on my family when we go to Cracker Barrel. When he walks in, he'll snap his fingers and tell the hostess, he'll say, my section. He'll point, my section. And we've built quite a rapport with this young man. So that may be another reason that you're called on to serve. And honestly, that's more common than you think, because a lot of people, when you're sitting there making funeral arrangements, and they've done the obvious, they've put down the obituary, they've listed this one, that one, they've set the funeral time, picked the casket, but when it comes time to select the ministers, the old saying, they look at you like a mule looking at a new gate. They don't have, I don't know, I just don't know. And that happens way, way more than you know. Sometimes it might be someone that heard you at another service, whether it be a funeral or at your wedding, or came to your church to visit, and they liked what you had to say and decided that you would perform his or her funeral services. I see this very often. Well, I like what he said. You know, he did so-and-so's funeral. He did a good job. Just get him for Dad. You know, Dad didn't really have a church home, so I was at so-and-so's funeral, and brother so-and-so, he did a good job. Just ask him if he'll do it. If your church has a radio or television ministry, you are reaching people you've never met and may never meet. Nonetheless, they may like your style of ministry. You just became their preacher and you didn't even know it. And I hear that quite a bit. Oh, well, you know, Mom wasn't able to get the last 5 or 6 years, but she listened to so-and-so's program on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, Thursdays, whenever it aired, or Sunday mornings, and she really liked him. So could you call and ask him to come do the service? And that person had never met him. He always said so-and-so, well, he's my little preacher now. I listen to him every Sunday, or I listen to his broadcast on Sunday night, whatever. That happens just way more than you could ever think. These services will always present a challenge, but still on these services, gathering information is usually pretty easy. You have people that you're familiar with. Like I say, it could be a student that Bobby had contact with at the college who he was kind to, and they don't really even know Bobby. They say, I know he's a preacher, and I know he's kind. He was very sweet and gentle and helped me through my situation. I'm sure I can ask him to do it. So there, he just became the guy that's going to do the funeral. And while Bobby may not know the deceased or whoever's doing the service, that person was familiar enough to ask you, then you're comfortable enough to sit down and say, hey, let's gather some information. Let's talk about it. Tell me, what did they do? Did they like sports? Did they ever go to church? I mean, just information still, it's not as readily available to you as it would be if it was a member of your church, but it's still pretty easy to gather information on because somebody loved them enough to arrange their funeral, to seek you out. So you're still getting pretty easy information to gather. And the last line here, my wife questioned me on this last night, but you just have to have a willingness and a patience to find the one thing about that person that will allow you to create a suitable memorial. And it may just be one thing. You may get 20, but there may be one thing and you go, that's it. That's the one key piece I needed to build an entire funeral message. And a lot of times that's the case. These are the hard funerals. This is a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald's funeral, and when Mike called me, I tried to think what were the easy ones to do, and I'm going to bring this home here in a minute. What were the hard ones? What were the middle ground ones? In the picture, you'll see the men standing in the back at the funeral. Those are all reporters and Secret Service. The three family members, well, Lee Harvey's wife, brother, his mother, and his two infant daughters were the only people there who were actual mourners. On November 25th, 1963, three notable funeral services were held in the United States. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. His funeral services were conducted by Roman Catholic Cardinal Richard Cushing, who was, in fact, when President Kennedy went to church in Washington, that was his pastor. Pretty easy to gather information on the president, whether you loved him or hated him, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. They all do good works, and they all do things that we just think are despicable, but pretty easy subject to preach. I think if, I'm not a minister, but I believe if somebody called me to speak at the president's funeral, I believe I could probably pull it off, just by what I know and getting on the internet, which of course they didn't have then. And it was probably a lot better time. The next funeral was J.D. Tippit. He was a Dallas, Texas police officer. I think we know the story about him. He was the police officer that was alleged to have been shot by Lee Harvey Oswald about an hour after the Kennedy assassination. His funeral services were conducted by the Reverend C.D. Tips Jr. Now, I researched these people because I got really interested in this. And Mike and I have had conversations about it this week, and it's become kind of a little bit of an obsession. I've spent the better part of a week researching all these people. C.D. Tips was pastor of a large church there. I never could really I didn't find anything that said that he was J.D. Tippit's pastor, but he certainly was honored to do this fallen policeman who had a stellar record, no blemishes on his record as a policeman, citations for doing his job right, heroism, pretty easy funeral to do. Then came Lee Harvey Oswald, suspected assassin of John F. Kennedy. Funeral services were conducted by the Reverend Lewis Saunders. And Reverend Lewis Saunders was quite a read this week. Cardinal Cushing, Reverend Tips were given the sad duty of presiding over the funeral services of two men who were murdered just for doing their jobs. John Kennedy was murdered for his ideas, his ideology, things that I think maybe that people thought he should be doing and he wasn't. Officer Tippett, for the same reason. He saw a man who looked suspicious in a situation where the president just murdered. Everybody was a suspect. He attempted to stop him. He was shot 5 times, point blank range. President Kennedy's life and service, for the most part, was a matter of public record. Officer Tippett's reputation as an honest police officer and loving husband and father was evidenced by the outpouring of love and support shown by his fellow officers and the nation in general. And the Reverend Tipps, who did Officer Tippett's funeral, sure he didn't have any problem going to any member of the Dallas Police Department, from the chief down to the newest recruit, or people who worked in his precinct or his squad who didn't have, they all had good stories to say about him, you know, heroic things, things he'd done to benefit other people's lives. There again, I believe I could have stepped into that role. I believe any of us in this room could have actually stepped up there, spent some time with these people, and pulled off a really suitable, meaningful memorial service. Lewis Saunders. Who was he and why was he charged with presiding over the funeral of Lee Harvey Oswald? Well, in my research on him, I found out that he was a graduate of Johnson Bible College. He studied theology at Duke University and received his divinity degree from Vanderbilt University. He served in the U.S. Army and participated in the invasion of Normandy. While in the Army, they sent him to chaplain's training school at Harvard, which he completed at Harvard University. He served as a missionary in the remote Luzon region of the Philippines, which is where he met his wife, and they were married a few years later. He served as a pastor and interim pastor at several churches in the Fort Worth, which is Dallas-Fort Worth area, but in the Fort Worth area. In 1957, he became executive director of the Fort Worth Council of Churches, which was an interdenominational group. And in that, as his capacity as executive director, he coordinated various social and other programs in his area within the interdenominational thing. What I could tell from reading about him, it was said that while he was making arrangements for an interdenominational memorial service for President Kennedy, Reverend Saunders was also busy making sure that there would be a minister present for the Oswald family. Excuse me, my mouth's dry. When they buried him at Rose Hill Cemetery in Fort Worth. Now, he had personally contacted Mrs. Oswald, who she was, I believe, a Lutheran. Well, it's in the next paragraph, but he was making sure, and she assured him that she had 2 Lutheran ministers who were going to do the funeral service for her son. On the day of Lee Harvey Oswald's service, Reverend Saunders, he decided to attend as nothing more than an observer. And he went. They had heavy security, were checking people at the gate, and from best I could tell, he was on the list of people who were allowed into the cemetery. When he got into the cemetery up to the tent, the 2 ministers that promised Miss Oswald that they would be there, people from her own faith, her own denomination, decided not to come. They were afraid there would be snipers and people who would not want them to be up there speaking any kind words over the most hated man in the United States at the time. So they didn't show up. Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite, was informed that these ministers were not coming, and I think this happened at the cemetery that they sent word. And she knew Reverend Saunders because earlier in the week he had been trying to coordinate with her, are you going to have ministers? So she was familiar with him. She knew who he was. And she asked him right there on the spot if he would officiate the service, and he said yes. Now, he came as an observer, hadn't prepared anything. She asked him, standing right there, will you do the service? And he did. He was not the only impromptu participant. There were no pallbearers, and members of the attending press corps were asked to carry the casket, which they reluctantly did. And being as we're in church, I will not quote or paraphrase what some of them said when asked to do it, but let's just say they didn't want to do it. Having left his Bible in the car, Reverend Saunders stepped up to the graveside and quoted the 23rd Psalm and a passage from the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John, both from memory. From what information could be gathered, the short funeral service consisted of Reverend Saunders saying, "Mrs. Oswald tells me her son, Lee Harvey, was a good boy and she loved him. And today we commit his spirit to your divine care." He concluded the brief service by saying, "God of the open sky and of the infinite universe, we pray and petition for this family that is heartbroken. Those who suffer and have tears in their hearts will pray for them. Their need is great." Now, that's not a lot of words at a funeral service. Now, one thing I did find out after I put this together, the very final statement, and I didn't see that till later researches, he said, "May God have mercy on his soul." And that doesn't really sound like a lot of words, and that's true, but it was adequate. In those few words of Scripture offered to those left behind, there was a message of hope. And after all, when all is said and done, hope is the very best we have to offer, as Brother Mike said. Hope is what you all can bring to them. Sometimes that's all you can bring to the table, nothing else. Assurances that they're in the hand of a merciful and just God. My dad used to say when I was a kid, he said, somebody would say something about him. My dad was a banker, and if he'd have to turn somebody down for a loan, he'd be the biggest you-know-what in town. And he'd say, "Boy, I'm glad I'm not going to have to see him on Judgment Day." So, you can do great good with a few words, and you can do a lot of harm with many words, and vice versa. When I graduated from mortuary school in 1982, the speaker at our service asked us if we were going to be tops in our fields. And any of y'all that know the Reverend Billy Gabriel, you've heard him preach on this, because he and I told him about it. He liked it and he wanted to borrow it, and I said, "Well, it's not mine to lend, so feel free." But you've heard people, "Oh, you're tops with me," or you're tops in your field, but have you ever considered what it takes to become tops? Now, I just briefly skimmed over the funerals, because you've got the general idea. You're going to have three types. You can lump them however you want to, but you're going to have three types of funerals. The ones you know, the ones you're familiar with, and the ones you don't know. That's it. But what does it take to become tops in your field? And of course, I was 18 at the time. We're all sitting there shaking our heads. The other person's shoes. Put yourself in their shoes, and that will well get you on your way to becoming tops in your field. You younger guys, when you see people with gray hair and they open their mouth, probably ought to listen, because they've been there, done it. They'll saying, bought the book, the t-shirt and the sweatshirt. They've got a lot of experience to draw on. And one of the things that an older funeral director told me when I first graduated from mortuary school, he said, "This job's easy if you'll let it be." And he said, "I'm going to give you some tips along the way." One of them was, he said, the best funeral he'd ever been to was the one where you see the least of the undertaker. He said that means everything's going smoothly and the undertaker doesn't need to intervene. So I remembered that. He told me, he said, all good undertakers have two things with them at all times: pocket knife and a fountain pen. I'm not a good undertaker, but according to him, I've got the right equipment. But one of the things he told me, he said, that really stuck with me, actually two things, and we'll get to one of them here in a minute. He told me, he said, no, it was one of the older Kaywood families members, Mr. Pope Kaywood, and his family had started a funeral home, and we took it over in '78, and it's continually operated for 80 years by just two families. And Mr. Kaywood told me, he said, this table right here, he said, there's been tens of thousands of people sit here and make funeral arrangements. He said, and one of these days, you're going to be the one sitting here with them. I naturally, at 18, 19 years old, wasn't just immersed into that. It's kind of work up to it. He said, when you sit down and you sit on this side of the table, when you start talking to these two people, just pretend you're sitting on the other side of the table. How would you want to be spoken to? What would you want said to you? What would you want not said to you? He said, it's easy. Easiest thing you can do is just to treat people the way you want to be treated. And that has served me about as well as anything. Some people, you can inject a little humor in. Mike's been around me, and some of y'all know I can inject humor with the best of them. But I can also read people well enough to know that I need to keep my mouth shut. There are some people that don't want it, don't appreciate it, and they don't need it. Actually, they probably do need it, they're just not accustomed to it. But I think everybody needs to laugh and cry. The whole stages of grief, I think everybody needs to go through them. But that was a pretty powerful message that a guy named Mike St. Pierre gave to us when we graduated from mortuary school in August of '82. He owns some big funeral homes up in Indiana. His family is well known in funeral service up there. They own probably about 20 funeral homes. And that was, 32 years, 33 years later, I'm talking to you all about it, so you can see it stuck with me pretty good. And his presentation was, when he came out, he had an easel, and it was covered up with this real fancy velvet curtain, and when he pulled it off, there was the awfulest looking pair of Chuck Taylor red Converse that you've ever seen. They were worn out. And he used the worn out shoes for that analogy. Just put yourself in their shoes. It's, if you were somebody preparing something for a funeral of one of your loved ones, what would you like to hear? What would you not like to hear? I mean, that's easy done, and not just in your messages, the way you deal with them, the way you treat them. I know a lot of people ask for their ministers to come with them. They make funeral arrangements, and I'm fine with that. As a matter of fact, I encourage it, because sometimes that gives me a buffer between me and the family, because they will look and say, well, the preacher, he's done a lot of funerals, he'll know all about this. Well, in fact, the preacher's probably made funeral arrangements just like anybody once or twice in his life for family members. But by virtue of you doing so many funerals, people are going to think you know all about it. So it just offers them a level of comfort to have you there. I would suggest that, without being pushy, if there's somebody in your church who is doing that you ask them, would you like for me to be there? Don't be pushy about it. I think you'll find a lot of times they'll say yes. And we certainly welcome that. Like I say, sometimes it's like people are relieved because they may be apprehensive about talking to me, because I'm sitting there in a tie across the table asking them rapid fire questions, and even though they've had time to deal with the death, they've not had time to really think about the questions I've had to ask them. And one of the things I found that helps offset that is, every family, I tell them, say, now you're coming in tomorrow at 11, tonight when everybody's sitting around the supper table, jot down some of the obituary information. Get on the Daily News website, get on my website, look at other funeral homes' websites, see how obituaries are written. You don't have to write it, but put that information down. We'll arrange it for you. It accomplishes two things. It gives them something to do. It gives them all something to talk about. Well, Dad was a member of the Lions Club back in the 50s. Well, I didn't know it. Oh yeah, here's a certificate. Well, let's put that on there. It keeps them occupied, but it also keeps me from having to put them on the spot and ask them so many questions that a lot of times they don't know the answer to. You'd be surprised at how many people don't know their mother or grandmother's maiden names. They don't know where their parents were born. I very rarely meet with somebody, I say, where's your dad born? I don't know how to call my aunt and ask her. People just don't know. This gives them the opportunity to sit there and get this information together. And that may even be a good place for you to be as their pastors. Be at the house with them, assist them with that. You all have read obituaries at funerals. You know them as well as I do. You know what's in them. I tell people to customize them. I said, don't make it, like Mike says, a cookie cutter, just, born, died, here's your family. Put what you want to. If they like gardening, put that in there. If they like four-wheeling, if they like collecting mining script, put it in there. Whatever is, because it's the only chance you're going to get to do it. And this is the best piece of advice I ever got. Most important funeral you've ever done. A senator, fellow minister, a mayor, community leader, president even, they're a congressman, celebrity. There's one funeral home in Washington, D.C., and they're kind of like famous in my profession. It's Joseph Galler and Sons. They buried pretty much every president that's died since about 1830. They're old family business, and they handle all of the events for the president's funeral. Now, most of the time, you won't see them at a state funeral because they are, they've got people handling that in the military, but when they're brought to the place of repose, Joseph Gollars and Son is the one who does the embalming preparation, the casketing, and makes the preliminary funeral preparations. Joseph Gollars and Son does it. You all wouldn't know that name. They're, like I say, they're kind of a legend in our business because they've handled about every president's funeral since the early 1800s. The gentleman I was talking about, he asked me one time about the most important funeral I've ever done. And all the people I just named, certainly these folks are all important in their own way. They have touched and affected the lives of thousands or even hundreds of thousands throughout their careers. These people have always been afforded a certain amount of respect and have usually always been treated with awe and or respect. And some people who, the ones I just named, are afforded respect, probably don't deserve it, but that's another story for another day. But does that make them any more important than a bus driver, a janitor, a teacher, or even the person at your favorite restaurant that prepares your biscuits? No, it doesn't. I was 20 years old, and the gentleman I was speaking about, Mr. Kaywood, he asked me one day, he said, he called me Billy B. He said, now Billy B, he always does, he said, what's the most important funeral that you've had since you've been here? Well, I've been there since I was 15, so I was 5 years into it. I'd already been to mortuary school. And immediately, the mind of a 20-year-old, I went to, well, we buried a man that was a former senator in Virginia. And I was thinking about the people that we buried that had 800 people there and 400 bunches of flowers. And I was immediately going to big shots. And he slapped his hand down the table. He said, you don't have to answer me, I'll answer it. He said, the most important funeral that you'll ever have is the one that you'll do today and the one you're going to do tomorrow. That's the most important one. Doesn't matter what their stature was in the community, how high of a celebrity, how high of visibility. The most important funeral that you'll ever do is the one you're doing today. And those pieces of information, be it tops in your field, and those two have served me personally as a funeral director better than anything else that I have ever done. That advice I've been given, and I've been given a lot of good advice. Getting back to preparing funerals is, I hope this kind of put it in light for you what you're facing. You look at the Cardinal Cushing, who did John F. Kennedy's funeral. Well, there was probably, thousands of people that would have loved to have that honor to got up and been remembered throughout as long as written records are kept as the person who eulogized and buried John F. Kennedy. The Reverend Tips, who did J.D. Tippit, police officer's funeral. His name was a little harder to find, but there was no infamy involved. He did the funeral for what everybody considered a fallen hero. The man was just literally murdered for doing his job. And you get the Reverend Saunders, who was asked at the graveside. I think those three pretty much sum up how you're going to be immersed into a funeral. So church members are easy ones. We're having a funeral here Monday night. I've got to make arrangements with the family at 2:30, but I think we're going with Monday night. And Mike knows these people well. It's not going to be a hard one to prepare. I wouldn't think it would be. Not when you know the subject matter and you're familiar. So, last thing is I don't own any of the pictures. Here, I'll leave this up for a minute. These are some of the articles that I referenced to get these names. Now, like Mike, I don't really claim to own any of the content. I just used it. I figured it's easier to ask for forgiveness and permission. But I guess if I could sum it all up, as I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, Reverend Saunders probably did the Oswald family as much good as he could on the spot with just what probably amounted to 23rd Psalm, John 14, and what he said, I would imagine less than 3 or 4 minutes. But he showed, in my opinion, he showed them that when he accepted the call to be a minister, that he wasn't going to shun somebody because of their circumstances. And I think he did probably one of the biggest acts of Christianity is extending his willingness and ability to that family. Yes, I'll serve you. I'll serve you now. And he did it. And that speaks volumes to me personally. I think the other ministers were feared for their own safety, and I understand that. But this man showed a level of Christianity that I think that we all could learn a little bit from by stepping up and giving these people who were literally sitting there thinking, our son, our brother, my husband's the most hated man in the world right now. He's the most hated man. There's nobody here but policemen and Secret Service and reporters just wanting to get a story. There's 3 family members and 2 infants. And this Reverend Saunders, in about 3 minutes, stepped up and gave him a little message of hope. And with that, I'm done.
All right, thank you, man.